So I wrote this book called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and definitely until I was, say, 27, I would have never thought that I would write a book called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And I would certainly when I was young, I would think of this as bizarre. And I think part of the reason is, like, I'm 38. I mean, most people in my generation, I grew up in a liberal place, but I think even people who grew up in conservative places are taught that, like, fossil fuels are an addiction. They're a habit that we have. Maybe they're convenient, but they're leading us to environmental destruction. And why would we use them when we can use things like solar and wind and plants to get energy? I mean, that was certainly what I was brought up with. I grew up in a place called Chevy Chase, Maryland. So that's the Washington, D.C. area, which is not at all a pro-fossil fuel place. And I was fortunate enough to go to have a really strong math science background in training. I went to one of the top math science high schools in the country, and I was around a lot of really smart kids. And certainly my teachers were, if they talked about the issue, were certainly along the lines of fossil fuels are not a good thing. And science in some way has established that they're not a good thing. We should get off them. And one thing I noticed in retrospect is I had no idea of any positive of fossil fuels. Like, looking back, I see, well, it's interesting because all I ever heard were negatives about fossil fuels. And yet, given what I know now, I was using fossil fuels as a reason that, my three sisters and I probably have lived as long as we have, and so many things. But the way I was taught to think about it, being around a lot of scientific people, is just to look at, okay, what are these drawbacks? And if there are these drawbacks, then it's a wrong thing to use them. So that was definitely my background growing up with this issue.
So you pretty much came from the opposite perspective of what you have now.
Well, I certainly, my upbringing was. I mean, I was not, the perfect story I talk about in my book would be like if I joined Greenpeace or something like that, and then one day had an epiphany. But I was not, I'd say until I was like 15 or 16, I was just generally very sympathetic to the modern environmental movement and just straight bought into it. And then I started really studying philosophy. I became really interested in philosophy, in politics, and in particular, I was really interested in how can you think logically about these issues. I was taught to think logically in math and science and computer science. How can we think logically about these issues? And pretty early on, once I had that mindset, I found certain elements, at least of the free market position, to be more logical to me than the opposite position. And in particular, early on, the idea of individual responsibility really resonated with me. And I had a real issue with the tendency against individual responsibility. As I didn't have a fully developed philosophy, but that sort of pushed me into the more free market, what you might call libertarian side. And that led me to at least be open to there being issues with the modern environmental movement, which is often associated with liberals. So it's not as if I was a card-carrying Greenpeace member, but I certainly saw nothing really positive about fossil fuels, and I was certainly afraid of environmental catastrophe, particularly in terms of rising CO2 levels leading to destructive climate changes. I mean, that was on the back of my mind. That was in the back of my mind, and I didn't have any kind of answer to it, but I wasn't emotionally aligned with that whole, it wasn't like never my identity to be an environmentalist.
What was it about this specific discussion of like energy and the environment that drew you to that? Because there's a lot of issues you could probably have applied your philosophy or your political interests towards. Mm-hmm. Like, I know, I see the headlines and I know the environment is a big topic, but it's not something I've necessarily been drawn to, look into more. You obviously did.
Well, yeah, but it's interesting because it took a long time, because I only really got into it when I was 27, which is 11 or so years ago. And so when I was, 20, I guess when I became 18, I got really interested in philosophy in particular. And then I got particularly interested in what's called objectivist philosophy, which is Ayn Rand. I'm sure, I think you've had guests on from the Ayn Rand Institute. So, philosophy very focused on objective reality, rational thinking, individualism, individual freedom. And part of that is a very pro-human focus, like regarding human life as something like human life is a great thing. Human life is an important thing. It really, like, your happiness matters more than anything. I definitely had that philosophy. And I wanted to use philosophy to clarify different kinds of important issues in the world. And what's interesting is when I was 20, I decided this is what I want to do for a living in some form. And energy was the last issue on my mind. I just had no interest in it, no knowledge of it. And if you like Googled my name and other subjects I wrote about every subject you can imagine before energy. I mean, like biotech, cloning, foreign policy, digital stuff, net neutrality. And like energy was just the last thing on my mind. And then when I was 27, I was doing some research for a talk I was giving, and it was actually on journalism. It was on the history of business journalism. And to understand the history of business journalism, I looked at certain case studies of how journalists had portrayed businessmen historically. And I looked at John D. Rockefeller. And when I looked at Rockefeller to understand Rockefeller, and basically was Rockefeller a good guy or a bad guy, I had to understand he took over the oil industry, so-called, people would call it that. Like he dominated the oil industry. I had to look at what was the oil industry like before Rockefeller. And I started reading firsthand sources of what was it like before Rockefeller. And then I started reading about what was life like before oil, because it's very similar points in history. And what I saw is, wow, there were people on the countryside who in 1859 had darkness at night. And then by 1864, just 5 years later, they had light. And this just blew my mind. I thought, what is going on? Like, how is this possible? What happened? And I realized like there are two realizations that I had that made me permanently interested in energy. And so one realization is that cheap, plentiful, reliable energy is essential to human flourishing. So I'll break that down. So cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. It's important that there were a lot of different forms of energy before Rockefeller and before the oil industry, but they weren't cheap, plentiful, and reliable, and therefore people didn't have access to them. They weren't abundant in the world. And once they had that level of energy, then what they could do, basically, is they could use all sorts of machines. In the broad sense, you can think of all machines as tools. Basically, we had tools and fuels, if you want to remember it easily. Like that's what all of modern life is we have these advanced tools, and then we have lots of fuel to power those. And I realized, oh my gosh, everything in my life is tools and fuels. Like even me being here in this studio, coming from Laguna Beach, all of my pursuit of values is made possible by tools and fuels. And
when you talk about that in the book, like, it sounds so simple. Like, obviously, yes, everything, our entire lives are fueled by energy, but it's just something you never think about. And when you think about every single little thing, and you do this in the book, you break down like the clothes you're wearing, the floor you're walking on, the door frames you're walking there. Everything in our lives today is being fueled by machines for the most part.
Yeah. And I think it's helpful to look at the contrast, to look at what was life like before we had advanced tools and abundant fuel, because there are basically 4 billion or 3 billion people in the world today living without that now. And you think of what's the quality of life for billions of people. And the two terms I would use are the wealthier people can generally experience what I call human flourishing, which basically means people living to their full potential. And I would characterize most of life throughout history as human languishing or human suffering. People are living short lives, and they don't have very much control of their lives. And if you think about what do you want out of life, when I say human flourishing, for a lot of people that captures that, like I want to flourish, I want to live to my fullest potential. What that means ultimately is that you live a long time and that you have a lot of control over the experience of your life. So basically, you do the activities that you want in the places that you want with the people that you want. And it's important to recognize that nature doesn't give us any of that. In our natural state, we don't live a long time and we have very little control of our experience. So we don't have the activities we want. We're just basically in a subsistence state because we don't have tools and fuels. So we're helpless. We're in a state of basically of human helplessness. And part of the context of nature is that nature doesn't give us a good standard of living. So I think of it as there's a deficient planet. The planet is not this perfect, amazing Garden of Eden that gives us everything we need. So we have a deficient planet, and then we are naturally helpless. And that's why we suffer. That's why we languish. And what human beings did over time is they developed these amazing tools, and then they figured out how to fuel them, and then that empowered us. So I think of it as we went from human helplessness to human empowerment, and that helped take us from human languishing to human flourishing. And once I saw that picture, I saw a key indispensable part of this is the abundant fuel. And it turns out it's super, super hard to create abundant fuel for our planes, trains, automobiles, all of these machines in our lives. It's actually really, really hard to create fuel that is affordable for a lot of people, that's versatile, that can do things like fly a plane and electrify things. Portability is a big part of it. It's like really hard to actually do this. And I realized, that's why we're using fossil fuels. We're not using fossil fuels because we like them or because we just chose them randomly or because it's a habit or because it's an addiction. There's something that industry has done in terms of producing cheap, plentiful, reliable energy, this fuel abundance, that was really hard to do. And it's still really hard to do. And that's why we're using 80+% fossil fuels. It's not because we have a fetish for them or a habit. It's because it's really hard to produce the level of energy that we want with anything else.
So when did you decide that you really wanted to pursue that? Write a book on it, speak on it?
So in 2007, I gave this course on the history of journalism, and one of the segments was on Rockefeller. And so I started getting into it. I learned a lot about Rockefeller. And then in 2008, I gave a course on the history of the oil industry. And when I was researching the history of the oil industry, I would read about different debates throughout the history of the oil industry. And there are all kinds of debates about, for instance, foreign policy. And when I read these debates, I thought, oh God, I wish I had been there to debate this issue, because oil is the fuel of civilization. It's really the most important material in civilization because it's the most portable form of energy, and that just leads to so many things. So I just thought, wow, if I could have been involved in shaping the thought about oil, then that could have improved a lot of people's lives if I had been right and I'd been able to persuade people. And I thought, I can do that now. Like this issue of energy, I think people are thinking of it in very much the wrong way. In big part, they're not appreciating the benefits of fossil fuels. So if I can bring a better way of thinking to this issue and clarify it for people, that has a lot of leverage. Because if you think of energy as the industry that powers every other industry, it's better thinking can help the energy industry power the world more. And if we think badly about the issues, like if we think in an illogical way, we're even seeing today with, say, Venezuela, you think in an illogical way and a country can just totally crumble. And I saw energy, this is the root of all of our productivity and prosperity and flourishing. And so it's really important to give it that guidance. And so that was the first time in my life that a specific issue interested me enough to say, I want to gain expertise on that.
So you wrote the book. What?
Well, that's a long period between.
Over time, you wrote the book.
So I started developing the ideas, and it's funny because the book, it's very unusual. The book was sort of it's interesting how it came about, because the book is published by Penguin, which is one of the major publishers, and it's unusual for a book with a title like The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels to get kind of a mainstream acceptance. I think one thing that I did that was valuable to that is that I would publicly debate different people. So I had this perspective, I should summarize the perspective, which is basically that if you look at our energy choices from a human flourishing perspective, and that includes you look at both benefits and drawbacks. You don't just look at the negatives or just the positives, but if you look at both the benefits and the drawbacks of our different energy options, human flourishing requires using more fossil fuels, not less. So the idea is not, there are no drawbacks, there's no impact of CO2. That's not the argument. The argument is that it's a very net positive, and we'll probably go into more depth on that. But the core of my perspective was, the reason I think people aren't looking at this the right way is because they're not looking at it from a consistently human flourishing perspective. The way they're looking at the issue is they're primarily looking at in terms of, are we impacting the climate or not? So it's often defined as, do you believe in climate change? And for me, climate change, that's not a very precise term, but if we would say the warming influence of CO2, that's a side effect of fossil fuels. That's a potential drawback. So when I look at anything, I want to look at the benefits and the drawbacks, but I don't just want to look at the drawbacks. So for instance, if I'm deciding on vaccination, if you say, do you believe in vaccine side effects? And I say, sure, I believe vaccines have some side effects. That doesn't mean I'm against vaccines, because I can think vaccines benefits outweigh those side effects and drawbacks. And so I have a similar kind of position with fossil fuels. And I think the reason people are so focused just on the drawbacks, and particularly climate, is that their focus is the idea that we shouldn't be changing the planet, that we should be minimizing our impact on the planet.
Right.
If we go back to my perspective is the planet is naturally deficient. It's not nearly a good enough place for human beings to live, including the climate is incredibly hostile to us. I mean, the climate is variable, it's volatile, it's vicious. People used to be terrified of climate. They prayed to climate gods. So nature doesn't give us this perfectly safe climate and then we make it dangerous. It actually gives us a very dangerous climate and we need to make it safe. So I just became to totally reject this philosophy that the planet is perfect and anything we do is bad. And I had the perspective of let's focus on human flourishing and let's change the planet in the best overall way for human flourishing. And so even if we make it warmer to some degree, but our lives are overall better, philosophically, that's a good thing. And I find that my perspective on this issue is really about a philosophical framework, not just I believe in different facts. It's that my framework is a human flourishing framework, and their framework tends to be an unaltered nature framework. And so I took that framework and then my beliefs about the facts, and then I would debate Greenpeace, Sierra Club, this guy named Bill McKibben, and that led an agent, like a particularly high-profile literary agent, to reach out to me and say, hey, I think this is a really interesting case. And then that's what got me the contract, because people often think, yeah, it's totally crazy that anyone would publish this. But I would encourage other people, like, if you think you're really right about something and other people are wrong, go debate it. It's just like I do Brazilian jiu-jitsu as a major hobby of mine. Like, if you think you're better at jiu-jitsu than somebody or fighting, like, you go out and fight them professionally. Like, if you think your ideas are better, go debate them. And if they're afraid, then that says something. But usually someone will debate you. And if you have something to say that's significant, maybe that will show a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. And so how does that, to be perfectly honest, I don't entirely know, but how does it normally go for you? Like debating people or being out with this message for several years now? Because I can't imagine, it's definitely not the mainstream position to have.
Yeah.
You probably get a lot of blowback, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. It goes much better than people think, particularly as my position has evolved. So early on when I was debating, my position was still evolving quite a bit. And so there are a lot of facts I wasn't familiar with, and I just didn't have much experience debating with people. And I remember we used to do practice debates, like with different people, and someone who's now a colleague of mine, Don Watkins, who works for me. Like, I remember we did our first practice debate when I was debating someone from Greenpeace, and he just murdered me. And it was a really traumatizing, because I just thought, oh, like, I'm going to do so well. And he just brought out all this stuff, and I just had no idea. And he agreed with me, but he didn't agree with me in the fake debate. Like, he represented the Greenpeace position. He just killed me. But part of what I believe is, like, when I lose a debate, if I lose a debate, which hasn't really happened publicly, but certainly privately, it'll happen.
You're like, it's never happened.
No. I mean, like, losing is like, I try to really prepare. I mean, I like, you'll lose a bunch in private, but the question is, was I wrong? Like, to the extent I do badly, even if people think of it as a stalemate or I won, certain things won't go as well. I'll think of it like, was I wrong? Or was I just not clear enough? And, occasionally I found out I think I'm wrong about some detail, but overwhelmingly I've thought, yeah, my human flourishing perspective is right, and fossil fuels are overwhelmingly good, and there's been something wrong with my explanation. And so my motivation is always, how do you explain it clear? And my belief is, to the extent whenever I am unsuccessful with an audience, I will just go back and think, well, how could I have explained it better? And so over time, what that's led to is I've had a lot of success. Now, when I talk to people, I have a very high success rate, I've lived in San Francisco, a bunch in the past several years. And you might think that's pretty hard, but I have a way of framing the discussion so that people will be open to it. And the basic thing I'm always doing is saying, look, would you agree that ultimately we want to take the course of action that's really best for human beings now and in the future? And then to do that, we have to look at the benefits and the drawbacks of all our options. We can't just look at the benefits of solar and the drawbacks of fossil fuels. We have to look at the benefits of fossil fuels and the drawbacks of fossil fuels, and the benefits of solar and the drawbacks of solar. And almost everyone will agree to that framework. And then once you've framed the discussion, then people are more open to the facts. But if the discussion is not framed with a clear goal and clear rules of thinking, then people will default to being very biased against fossil fuels and very biased toward solar and wind, even though that's not really what they want to be. It's just that's the default.
Yeah, I mean, I was telling you before we started shooting that I actually know very little about this topic on energy, the environment, climate change, the whole issue. And you're the first guest we've had on to talk about it. So coming into this, like, again, I'm trying my best at this point in my life to not really have an opinion on something that I'm just simply not knowledgeable of. But it's like you can't help but have this slight I guess, bias a little bit, because it's all you hear is like fossil fuels are bad, or the earth is warming, global warming, climate change. Like it's everywhere.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's other people who are also pro fossil fuels, but you're the first one that I really know of. You're definitely the most prominent one I know of. And then I read your book. And you're right. I mean, you do spell things out in a very logical way. I really do appreciate the framework that you just said, which is you do a cost-benefit analysis of every form of energy, which I'll want to do in a little bit. Because for the average person, I consider myself in that, who doesn't know about this topic, it's a really good breakdown. And it's, from what I can tell, you know, who knows what other people would say, but from what I can tell, like, you're looking at it from both sides.
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting because in most issues, most of us are in the position of we lack expertise. So this is just a chronic issue. I actually have a whole podcast about this called the Human Flourishing Project. And it's all about human flourishing. But in particular, how do we actually know what's good for us in different areas of life, like nutrition and psychology? And so in any given area, we're going to be ignorant for the most part. But one thing we can look at, we can have an idea about ourselves is what's a good framework for looking at these issues. And then when we encounter people who claim expertise, are they really looking at it in a way that makes sense? So I'll give you an example. There's a guy named Michael Mann, who's a very prominent, I would call him climate catastrophist.
You're not talking about the documentary filmmaker?
No, not the director.
Got it.
But in climate, so this shows you're not immersed in this. You're immersed in one world versus another. Because like in the climate energy world, Michael Mann, he became a phenomenon for what's called the hockey stick, which is. That's a whole technical subject, but he has a book. It's called The Madhouse Effect. I was reading it recently. I'm working on a new version of Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And one thing I wanted to do is I wanted to look for the best arguments against my position. I wanted to revisit them and revisit the state of them. And I was looking at his book, and he's focused on climate, and he'll talk about something like, here's how climate change is affecting food negatively. And I recommend just pick up that book and look at the section on food. And the whole thing you notice is the only thing it says about fossil fuels and food is negatives. And fossil fuels, they're warming the climate, and then that's causing negative impacts on food. And there's even a question of would warming cause negative impacts on food, but even leaving that aside. But there's this whole context, if you know anything about food, that food is overwhelmingly grown using fossil fuels. I mean, 4 decades ago, we were all supposed to starve to death because of a population bomb because we were going to run out of food. And the thing that basically diffused that bomb and that allowed us to have more food per person, even though we have twice as many people as we did, is basically fossil-fueled agriculture. So we have natural gas that creates fertilizer that made agriculture much more abundant. And we have oil-powered machines that allow you to reap enough wheat for 500,000 loaves of bread a day. It's basically tools and fuels, right? Before we had advanced tools and abundant fuel, we're farming by hand, or, we're using animals. And of course, we're going to be in terrible shape. But it's fossil fueled agriculture. Food as we know it depends on fossil fuel agriculture. So how can you possibly talk about food and fossil fuels and not mention those benefits and only the drawbacks? It'd be like someone writes a book about vaccines and health, and they only write about negatives. And you're like, hey, wait a minute, what was life like when we had polio and we had to be afraid of all of these things? Like, you have to take that seriously if you're thinking about this issue. So when I started looking at this issue, I noticed, oh my gosh, the whole thought leadership of what I would call our knowledge system in our society, they're so focused on the future risks of fossil fuels, but there's almost no focus on what is the beneficial role that it plays in our lives. That's one. And also how hard it would be to substitute for fossil fuels in that role. There's just this assumption, yeah, it's kind of convenient, but it's not that big a deal. Yeah, and of course we can replace it using solar and wind. And that's a really dangerously superficial view. And so what I would like the knowledge system to do, even if they disagree with me, is acknowledge the incredible positive role of fossil fuels and acknowledge how difficult it's been to substitute for them. And then if you claim, oh, there's finally a new substitute, or the drawbacks are now so big that it's not worth using fossil fuels, then I would buy that. But if you just give me a pure negative perspective on fossil fuels, then I'm going to think that you're really biased and that you're not going to give me the right answer.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.